Picture this: a man who once commanded armies of thousands, who lived in palaces filled with gold, who could snap his fingers and have entire banquets appear before him, now lies on a cold stone floor, his royal robes tattered and stained. His stomach, once round from endless feasts, now caves inward like a hollow drum. His lips, cracked and bleeding, whisper the same words over and over: "I trusted you. I trusted you all." This is not the beginning of our story. This is the end. But to understand how a king who ruled over fertile lands and prosperous cities could die such a wretched death, we must go back to where it all began. Back to when King Aldric the Third sat proudly on his golden throne, surrounded by advisors who smiled with their lips but plotted with their hearts. This is the tale of a monarch whose greatest weakness wasn't his enemies, but his inability to see the wolves dressed as loyal sheep. A story that will make you question everyone around you and remind you that sometimes the deadliest poison comes from the hands of those we trust most. King Aldric the Third inherited more than just a crown when his father died. He inherited a kingdom that was the envy of neighboring realms. The Kingdom of Valdris stretched across 3 major river valleys, boasted the continent's most fertile farmlands, and sat at the crossroads of every major trade route between the Eastern and Western empires. Gold flowed through Valdris like water through a stream, and the royal treasury was said to be deeper than the ocean itself. But Aldric was not his father. Where King Aldric II had been a shrewd politician who kept detailed records of every grain of wheat in his kingdom and every coin in his treasury, his son preferred the comfort of delegation. Why should a king dirty his hands with numbers and ledgers? Aldric would often say, lounging in his silk-cushioned throne while his advisors presented him with scrolls he barely glanced at before stamping with his royal seal. The young king had inherited his father's advisors, but he lacked his father's wisdom to manage them. Chief among these was Lord Cassius Blackthorne, the kingdom's treasurer and economic advisor. Blackthorne was a tall, gaunt man with sharp cheekbones and eyes like black diamonds, beautiful to look at, but cold and cutting. He had served the crown for over 2 decades, and his knowledge of Valdris's financial systems was unmatched. "Your Majesty," Blackthorne would purr during their morning meetings. "The kingdom's coffers overflow with abundance. Perhaps it's time to enjoy the fruits of your father's careful planning. After all, what is the point of being king if you cannot live like one?" Beside him stood General Marcus Ironhold, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned during the previous king's reign. Ironhold was built like a castle wall, broad, imposing, and seemingly unshakable. His scarred hands had held swords in defense of the realm for 30 years, and his strategic mind had won countless battles. But power has a way of changing men, and the general who had once fought for honor now hungered for something more. "The kingdom is secure, my lord," Ironhold would report, his deep voice echoing through the throne room. "Our armies are strong, our borders are peaceful. There is no threat to your reign that requires your direct attention." The third member of this inner circle was Lady Silvertongue, the kingdom's chief diplomatic advisor and, secretly, its most dangerous manipulator. Beautiful in the way that Venus flytraps are beautiful, alluring, mesmerizing, and deadly to those who came too close. She had convinced 3 neighboring kingdoms to sign treaties favorable to Valdris, and her network of spies and informants stretched across the continent like a spider's web. "Your Majesty's reputation precedes him," she would whisper, her voice like honey over poisoned steel. "The other kingdoms speak of your wisdom and generosity. They would never dare move against such a beloved ruler." These 3 advisors formed what they privately called the Triangle, a term that would have terrified King Aldric had he known of its existence. Each controlled a crucial aspect of the kingdom: the treasury, the military, and the flow of information. Together, they were slowly but systematically dismantling everything the previous king had built, all while convincing his son that he was living in a golden age of prosperity and peace. The truth was far different. While King Aldric spent his days hunting in the royal forests and his nights hosting elaborate feasts, his trusted advisors were executing the most audacious theft in the kingdom's history. But this wasn't a simple matter of stealing gold from the treasury. This was far more sophisticated and infinitely more devastating. Lord Blackthorne had discovered something that his predecessors had missed. The kingdom's wealth wasn't just in its gold reserves, but in its complex system of trade agreements, land grants, and agricultural contracts. The previous king had created an intricate web of economic relationships that generated wealth continuously, like a machine that printed money. But machines can be reprogrammed, and contracts can be modified. Working in his private chambers late into the night, Blackthorne began the delicate process of redirecting the kingdom's wealth. He created shell companies in neighboring kingdoms, dummy corporations that existed only on paper but somehow managed to win every major government contract. He negotiated new trade agreements that appeared favorable to Valdris on the surface but contained hidden clauses that diverted profits to accounts he controlled. The beauty of Blackthorne's scheme was its subtlety. The kingdom's income didn't disappear overnight. It leaked away slowly, like water through a cracked dam. The royal treasury still received its regular deposits, but they grew smaller each month. Taxes were still collected, but processing fees and administrative costs seemed to increase dramatically. Trade still flowed through Valdris, but somehow the kingdom's share of the profits kept shrinking. Meanwhile, General Ironhold was playing his own dangerous game. The kingdom's military had always been funded through a combination of royal treasury allocations and feudal obligations from the nobility. But Ironhold began quietly restructuring these arrangements, convincing noble houses to pay their military obligations directly to him rather than through the traditional royal channels. "These are simply administrative improvements, Your Majesty," he would explain to King Aldric during their weekly military briefings. "By centralizing military funding, we can respond more quickly to threats and eliminate bureaucratic inefficiencies." What Ironhold didn't mention was that this centralization gave him direct control over the kingdom's armed forces. The soldiers' loyalty began shifting from the crown to the general who signed their paychecks. Slowly but surely, Ironhold was building his own private army within the kingdom's official military structure. Lady Silvertongue's role was perhaps the most crucial of all. As the kingdom's chief diplomat and intelligence coordinator, she controlled the flow of information both into and out of Valdris. She determined what news reached the king's ears, what reports made it to his desk, and what intelligence was deemed important enough for royal attention. Under her careful management, King Aldric received only good news. Reports of successful harvests that were actually failing, accounts of prosperous trade relationships that were actually being dissolved, and intelligence about peaceful neighboring kingdoms that were actually growing increasingly aggressive as Valdris appeared to weaken. But Silvertongue's most insidious contribution was her management of the kingdom's spy network. The previous king had maintained an extensive intelligence operation that monitored everything from grain prices in distant markets to the movements of foreign armies. This network had been Valdris's early warning system, its protection against both economic and military threats. Under Silvertongue's direction, this network gradually transformed from a tool of royal protection into an instrument of royal isolation. Spies who had once reported directly to the crown now reported to Lady Silvertongue, who filtered their intelligence through her own agenda. Gradually, the king became blind to the realities of his own kingdom. The first signs of trouble began appearing in the kingdom's outer provinces, far from the capital where King Aldric spent his comfortable days. These early warnings came in the form of increased banditry, failed harvests that seemed to strike with unusual frequency, and reports of neighboring kingdoms moving troops closer to Valdris's borders. In the province of Westmarch, Baron Theodric the Bold had been struggling to maintain order as his tax revenues mysteriously decreased month after month. The Baron was an honest man who had served the crown faithfully for 20 years, but he found himself increasingly unable to fund local infrastructure projects or maintain adequate security forces. "Something is wrong with the numbers," Baron Theodric wrote in his increasingly frantic letters to the capital. "Our harvests have been good. Our trade routes are active, but somehow we have less money than ever before. I request an audit of our tax collection systems and trade agreements." These letters reached Lady Silvertongue's desk, where they were carefully filed away and never seen by royal eyes. Instead, King Aldric received cheerful reports about Baron Theodric's successful administrative improvements and innovative cost-cutting measures. Similar stories were unfolding across the kingdom. In the southern province of Goldenvale, Duchess Isabel the Wise watched helplessly as her once prosperous region descended into economic chaos. Mining operations that had produced wealth for generations suddenly became unprofitable. Trade caravans that had traveled safely through her lands for decades began reporting increased bandit attacks and administrative difficulties at border checkpoints. The Duchess, being more politically astute than Baron Theodric, began conducting her own investigation. What she discovered terrified her. Contracts that her province had signed with the royal government contained clauses she had never seen before, clauses that diverted most of their mining profits to obscure companies in foreign kingdoms. "These contracts bear my seal," she wrote to her most trusted advisor. "But I swear by all the gods that I have never seen these terms before. Someone has been forging official documents using my authority." Duchess Isabel's attempts to contact the king directly were intercepted by Lady Silvertongue, who assured her that His Majesty is aware of the situation and working on solutions. The solutions, however, never came. The most troubling developments were occurring along the kingdom's borders. Commander Sarah Blackwood, who oversaw the northern frontier, began noticing unusual military activities in the neighboring kingdom of Ironhold. Troops were gathering just beyond Valdris's borders, and scouts reported the construction of what appeared to be siege equipment. Commander Blackwood's reports reached General Ironhold's desk, where they underwent significant editing before being passed along to the king. The unusual military activities became routine training exercises. The gathering troops were described as peaceful merchants and travelers. The siege equipment was explained as agricultural machinery for the spring planting season. King Aldric, comfortable in his palace and trusting in his advisor's expertise, saw no reason to question these explanations. After all, why would General Ironhold, the kingdom's most experienced military leader, downplay genuine threats to the realm? The answer to that question lay in a series of secret meetings that General Ironhold had been conducting with representatives from neighboring kingdoms. The general had been quietly negotiating his own future, one that didn't include loyalty to King Aldric or the Kingdom of Valdris. As winter approached in the third year of King Aldric's reign, the carefully orchestrated conspiracy reached its critical phase. The kingdom's wealth had been systematically drained, its military had been compromised, and its information networks had been turned against the crown. But the conspirators faced a delicate challenge. They needed to maintain the illusion of prosperity just long enough to complete their preparations. Lord Blackthorne had reached the limits of his financial manipulation. The royal treasury, once overflowing with gold, now contained barely enough to fund the kingdom's operations for another few months. The complex web of shell companies and fraudulent contracts had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but success brought its own dangers. Soon, even King Aldric would notice that the kingdom could no longer afford its basic expenses. The treasurer's solution was audacious in its simplicity. He would loan the kingdom money from his own private investments to cover the shortfall. Of course, these private investments were funded entirely by the wealth he had stolen from Valdris, but the loan documents wouldn't reflect that detail. Instead, They would show Lord Blackthorne as a generous patriot who had stepped forward to help his kingdom in its hour of need. "Your Majesty," Blackthorne explained during what would be their final meeting, "the kingdom faces temporary cash flow challenges due to seasonal variations in trade revenues. I have taken the liberty of arranging a short-term loan from my personal holdings to ensure continuity of operations." King Aldric, who had never bothered to understand the details of royal finances, was grateful for his treasurer's foresight and generosity. He signed the loan documents without reading them, thereby legally transferring ownership of vast portions of his kingdom to the man who had been systematically destroying it. General Ironhold's preparations were more direct but equally devastating. Over the past 3 years, he had gradually replaced key officers throughout the kingdom's military with men loyal to him personally rather than to the crown. He had relocated the most elite units to positions where they could quickly seize control of strategic locations. Most importantly, he had established communication channels with military leaders in neighboring kingdoms who were eager to see Valdris weakened. The general's masterstroke came in the form of a military exercise that he proposed to King Aldric. "Your Majesty, our forces have grown soft from years of peace. I recommend a large-scale training operation that will test our readiness and demonstrate our strength to potential enemies. This training operation would position the kingdom's most loyal units far from the capital, scattered across remote locations where they would be isolated and vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ironhold's hand-picked officers would remain in control of the forces stationed near important cities and strategic resources." Lady Silvertongue's role in the final phase was perhaps the most crucial of all. She needed to ensure that King Aldric remained completely unaware of the danger until it was too late for him to respond effectively. This required her to manage an increasingly complex web of lies and misdirection. Reports of economic problems were explained as temporary market fluctuations. Military movements along the borders were described as diplomatic gestures of friendship. The absence of tax revenues from outer provinces was attributed to administrative delays in the new streamlined collection system. But Silvertongue's greatest achievement was her management of the king's personal relationships. Over the years, she had gradually isolated him from anyone who might provide independent information or advice. Loyal nobles who might have warned him were sent on important diplomatic missions to distant kingdoms. Old friends from his youth were discouraged from visiting through carefully orchestrated social snubs and bureaucratic obstacles. The result was that King Aldric found himself surrounded entirely by people who were either part of the conspiracy or unwitting tools of it. He had become a prisoner in his own palace, trapped not by bars and chains, but by his own misplaced trust and willful ignorance. The end came not with the clash of swords or the thunder of siege engines, but with a simple letter delivered to King Aldric's breakfast table on a cold morning in late winter. The letter, bearing the official seals of 3 neighboring kingdoms, informed His Majesty that the Kingdom of Valdris was in default on several major treaty obligations and trade agreements. Due to Valdris's failure to meet its financial commitments, the letter stated in formal diplomatic language, "The undersigned kingdoms hereby declare all previous agreements null and void. Furthermore, we demand immediate payment of outstanding debts totaling 500,000 gold talents, along with penalties and interest as specified in the original contracts." King Aldric stared at the letter in confusion. 500,000 gold talents was more money than his kingdom generated in 5 years of good harvests. There had to be some mistake. "Lord Blackthorne," he called, summoning his treasurer. "There seems to be some confusion about our international agreements. Please review our treaties and explain this absurd demand." But Lord Blackthorne was nowhere to be found. His chambers were empty, his personal effects gone, and his official records had mysteriously disappeared. A search of his private office revealed only empty safes and filing cabinets stripped of their contents. Panic beginning to set in, King Aldric turned to General Ironhold for military counsel. Surely the kingdom's armed forces could provide protection against these unreasonable foreign demands. But the general's response was not what the king expected. "Your Majesty," Ironhold said, his voice cold and formal, "I have received communications from military commanders throughout the kingdom. They report that their troops have not been paid in 3 months. Many units are on the verge of mutiny, and some have already abandoned their posts to seek employment as mercenaries in other kingdoms." The king's bewilderment turned to horror as the full scope of his situation became clear. "But the treasury, we have gold reserves." "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty," came Lady Silvertongue's voice from behind him. She had entered the throne room quietly, her usual graceful smile replaced by an expression of cold satisfaction. "The treasury has been empty for months. The kingdom's debts far exceed its assets, and your creditors are no longer willing to extend additional loans." King Aldric looked around the throne room that had been his seat of power for 3 years. The golden ornaments were gone, replaced by cheap brass imitations. The silk banners had been replaced with rough cloth. Even his throne, he realized with growing horror, was no longer the jewel-encrusted masterpiece his father had commissioned, but a simple wooden chair painted to look like gold. "You, all of you," he whispered, understanding finally dawning. "You've betrayed me." "Betrayed?" Lady Silvertongue laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Your Majesty, we simply gave you exactly what you wanted. You wanted to be a king without responsibilities, to enjoy power without the burden of actually ruling. We made that possible for you. But now," General Ironhold added, stepping forward with a document in his hand, "your carefree reign has come to an end. This is an abdication order. Sign it, and you will be allowed to leave the kingdom with your life and a small pension." King Aldric's hands shook as he looked at the document. "And if I refuse? Then you will be tried for treason, convicted of bankrupting the kingdom through gross negligence and mismanagement, and executed according to the ancient laws of Valdris," Lord Blackthorne said, emerging from the shadows where he had been watching the confrontation unfold. King Aldric did not sign the abdication papers. Whether from stubbornness, pride, or a final flash of the royal courage his father had possessed, he refused to surrender his crown voluntarily. This decision sealed his fate in ways he could not have imagined. "Very well," General Ironhold said, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "You will be confined to your chambers while preparations are made for your trial." The chambers turned out to be the castle's highest tower, a circular room that had once served as a storage space for old furniture and discarded tapestries. There was no bed, only a thin mattress on the stone floor. There was no fireplace, only a small window that let in cold air and provided a view of the kingdom that was no longer his. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torture that his former advisors had planned. Each day, one of them would visit to inform him of the kingdom's continued deterioration and to offer him one final chance to sign the abdication papers. "The eastern provinces have declared independence," Lady Silvertongue reported during her first visit. "They say they will no longer be governed by a king who cannot even feed his own people. Your former subjects are fleeing to neighboring kingdoms as refugees. The royal army has disbanded," General Ironhold announced a few days later. "Without pay or supplies, your soldiers have either joined mercenary companies or turned to banditry. The roads are no longer safe, and merchant caravans refuse to enter Valdris territory. The treasury has been seized by foreign creditors," Lord Blackthorne informed him with obvious satisfaction. "Your father's crown jewels, your mother's silverware, even the royal library has been sold to pay outstanding debts. There is nothing left of your inheritance." Each piece of news was designed to break the king's spirit, to convince him that signing the abdication papers was his only reasonable choice. But King Aldric, perhaps for the first time in his life, proved surprisingly stubborn. He would not give his enemies the satisfaction of a voluntary surrender. This defiance came at a terrible cost. His meals, which had started as simple but adequate fare, began to shrink in size and quality. The bread became staler, the soup thinner, the portions smaller. His captors claimed this was due to the kingdom's worsening food shortages, but Aldric suspected it was part of their strategy to break his will. As weeks turned into months, the king's physical condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The man who had once been robust from years of hunting and feasting now became gaunt and hollow-eyed. His royal robes, which had once fit him perfectly, hung loose on his shrinking frame. But the cruelest torture was the information his captors continued to provide about the outside world. Through the small window of his tower prison, he could see smoke rising from distant villages. His villages, his people, suffering because of his failures as a ruler. He could see the roads that had once carried prosperous merchant caravans now empty except for the occasional group of armed bandits. As spring arrived, King Aldric's situation became desperate. His daily meal had been reduced to a small piece of bread and a cup of water, barely enough to sustain life. His former advisors claimed that the kingdom's food stores were completely depleted, that even they were struggling to find adequate supplies. But on a particularly cold morning, King Aldric discovered the final, crushing truth about his situation. Looking out his window, he saw something that made his starving mind reel with disbelief. A grand feast being held in the castle's main courtyard. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh breads, exotic fruits, and fine wines. Lord Blackthorne, General Ironhold, and Lady Silvertongue sat at the head table, dressed in rich fabrics and laughing with guests who appeared to be foreign dignitaries. The very people who claimed the kingdom was too poor to feed its former king were hosting a celebration that would have impressed royalty. The realization hit him like a physical blow. There was no food shortage. There never had been. His starvation was not a consequence of the kingdom's poverty, but a deliberate choice made by his captors. They were torturing him not out of necessity, but out of cruelty. With this understanding came another, even more devastating truth. His former advisors had not betrayed him for money or power. They had betrayed him for the simple pleasure of watching him suffer. They could have killed him quickly, could have had him executed and been done with it. But they chose instead to let him die slowly, to savor his gradual destruction. That night, as King Aldric lay on his thin mattress and listened to the sounds of celebration drifting up from below, he finally understood the full scope of his foolishness. He had trusted these people not because they had earned his trust, but because trusting them was easier than thinking for himself. He had given them power over his kingdom because wielding that power himself would have required effort and sacrifice. His father had warned him in those final weeks before his death. A king who does not know his own kingdom is not a king at all. He is merely a puppet waiting for someone to cut his strings. Now, as hunger gnawed at his belly and cold seeped through his bones, King Aldric finally understood what his father had meant. But understanding came too late. King Aldric's final weeks were a study in the complete destruction of a human being. As his body wasted away from starvation, his mind began to fracture under the weight of his situation. He spoke to imaginary advisors, gave orders to guards who were not there, and held conversations with the father whose warnings he had ignored. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. He was dying of hunger in a kingdom that had once been famous for its agricultural abundance. He was dying alone in a castle filled with people who had once bowed before his throne. He was dying powerless in a realm he had once ruled absolutely. His former advisors continued their visits, but their pretense of concern had vanished entirely. Now they came simply to mock his suffering and to remind him that his ordeal could end at any time if he would only sign the abdication papers. "Your signature would be worth a comfortable exile," Lady Silvertongue would say, her beautiful face twisted with contempt. "You could live out your remaining years in peace, far from the kingdom you destroyed. But you're too proud, aren't you?" General Ironhold would add. "Too proud to admit your failures. Too stubborn to accept responsibility for your people's suffering. So you'll die here instead," Lord Blackthorne would conclude. Forgotten and unmourned, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. But even as his body failed and his mind wandered, King Aldric clung to one final act of defiance. He would not sign their papers. He would not give them the legal legitimacy they craved for their coup. If he was going to die, he would die as the rightful King of Valdris, not as an abdicated fool who had voluntarily surrendered his crown. This decision meant that his suffering would continue until his natural death, but it also meant that his enemies would face legal complications when they tried to claim legitimate authority over the kingdom. Without his signature on the abdication papers, they would be nothing more than successful rebels, vulnerable to challenges from other claimants to the throne. In his lucid moments, King Aldric took some small satisfaction in this knowledge. He had finally found a way to strike back at the people who had destroyed him and his kingdom. King Aldric the Third died on a Tuesday morning in late spring, alone in his tower prison. His guards found him curled on his thin mattress, his body so wasted by starvation that he looked more like a skeleton than a man who had once ruled a prosperous kingdom. His last words, whispered to the empty air, were reported to be, "I should have listened. I should have seen." The three conspirators who had orchestrated his downfall tried to establish a ruling council to govern Valdris, but their victory was short-lived. Without the legal legitimacy that would have come from a signed abdication, neighboring kingdoms refused to recognize their authority. Within a year, Valdris had been divided among its more powerful neighbors, its people scattered as refugees, its once great cities reduced to ruins. Lord Blackthorne, General Ironhold, and Lady Silvertongue all met unpleasant ends. Blackthorne was assassinated by angry investors who had lost fortunes in his schemes. Ironhold was killed by his own soldiers when he could no longer pay them. Silvertongue disappeared entirely, presumably fleeing to some distant land where her reputation had not yet preceded her. The Kingdom of Valdris was erased from the map, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale told by historians and political philosophers. But the true lesson of King Aldric's story was not about the dangers of greed or ambition. It was about the fatal consequences of willful ignorance and misplaced trust. King Aldric died not because he was evil, but because he was lazy. He perished not because he was cruel to his people, but because he was indifferent to their welfare. His kingdom fell not because it was attacked by superior enemies, but because it was destroyed from within by people he should never have trusted. The horror of his death, starving in a tower while his captors feasted below, serves as a permanent reminder that power without responsibility is not just dangerous, it is ultimately self-destructive. A leader who does not lead will eventually find himself being led, usually toward his own destruction. In the end, King Aldric's fate was sealed not by his enemy's cleverness, but by his own refusal to do the hard work of ruling. He wanted the crown without the burden, the authority without the accountability, the respect without the effort to earn it. And so he died as he had lived in his final years, hungry for something he had thrown away through his own choices, surrounded by people who despised him, paying the ultimate price for trusting those who had never deserved his trust. The Kingdom of Valdris is gone, but its last king's story remains. A warning that in the game of power, there are no innocent victims, only those who choose wisdom and those who choose comfort. King Aldric chose comfort, and comfort, in the end, chose to abandon him entirely. His tomb bears no inscription, for there was no one left who cared enough to commission one. But if there had been, perhaps it would have read, "Here lies a king who trusted the wrong people and paid with everything he had. May others learn from his hunger what he failed to learn from his feast." The story of King Aldric the Third stands as eternal proof that the most dangerous enemies are often those who smile while they sharpen their knives, and that the heaviest chains are forged not from iron, but from our own willingness to let others think for us. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.